Hey everyone, and welcome back to Rank and File Sports. I'm Jonah, and this is Connor. And today we're coming at you with a little bit of a different video. We're going to be completely revamping the entire college football playoff system. It's, in my opinion, pretty broken right now. So we're going to show you the best way to fix it that's both logical, and then we'll go into the ideal world scenario of what a really good college football playoff would actually look like. And it's nothing like you were expecting, so make sure to stick around till the end of the video. So before we talk about the college football playoffs, we first need to address conference championships because that's one of the things that people have been discussing, maybe getting rid of and that kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on that, Connor?
So the big thing with conference championships is some of the conferences have a lot of high quality teams that don't get the benefit of playing in those extra games. Look at the Big Ten. You had Oregon versus Penn State this past season, but you left out Ohio State and Indiana. Both those teams got in. SEC, same thing. Texas, Georgia had a rematch, but Alabama, Tennessee, LSU, South Carolina, four teams that had legitimate college football playoff chances, didn't get that chance to prove themselves. So it's been a hot topic because you have to earn your way into those conference championship games, but having that extra game can really affect whether or not you are going to make the college football playoffs. So
Yeah.
for our revamped one, do we continue to have conference championships?
Yeah, another argument with the conference championships is the fact that teams who played in a conference championship had one less week of rest heading into the college football playoffs. And we saw all of the teams who got a bye end up losing in the quarterfinals of the playoffs to teams that had played the week before. And those teams hadn't had to play in a conference championship except for Texas and Penn State. So that's one of the things to look at. And that's what we think we're able to fix with our solution. So, do we need conference championships? I think we do, but we need to add something else. So, our solution is to have every team play during conference championship week. So, what does this look like? So, let's take a look at the SEC standings. Texas and Georgia obviously ended up playing in the SEC championship. And our proposal is for Alabama to go play at Tennessee again, South Carolina to go play at LSU, Ole Miss at Texas A&M, Florida at Missouri, Vanderbilt at Arkansas, Auburn at Oklahoma, and Mississippi State at Kentucky. Now, every team is going to get that extra game, and every team will have the opportunity to impress the committee with one more win. For Alabama, they now have a chance to avenge their road loss to Tennessee in the exact same environment. So this would change a lot of things, in my opinion. What do you think about this, Connor?
Yeah, it can change a lot of things, and not just in the SEC. Like the theoretical matchup for the Big Ten would be a rematch between Indiana and Ohio State. Indiana gets a win there. They might shoot up a couple seeds in the bracket. Ohio State might fall. Maybe they even fall out of the playoffs, having three losses to Indiana,
Yeah,
Ohio, and Michigan, along with Oregon. It can change so many things, especially since last year a lot of teams seemed to be very, very good. The conferences were very deep. So this could have changed a lot of things. Like you were saying earlier, Alabama gets rematch against Tennessee. They get a chance to avenge their loss. South Carolina, after getting essentially robbed of a win against LSU with that pick six getting called back, they get another chance. They get to go on the road to Death Valley to play LSU. They get a win there. They're probably in, considering they were that bubble team. And then Ole Miss, who had an up and down season, had some bad losses. Teams like Kentucky, they get to go on the road to Texas A&M in one of the most hostile environments in all of college football, and they get to prove, hey, maybe we still do belong here. They could hang 50 on Texas A&M, and they have a
Yeah.
legitimate chance to get in
And
there.
the one of the key points here for me is the big debate this year was Alabama versus SMU. And in the end, I think it was the fact that Alabama didn't have that extra game that even though
Mhm.
SMU lost, they still stayed in. If Alabama goes on the road and beats Tennessee the same week that Clemson beats SMU in the ACC championship, there is no argument whatsoever. Alabama's easily that 12th team in the playoffs.
Yeah, and if Alabama beats Tennessee, then the argument becomes, does Tennessee drop out of the playoffs? Or if they're still in the playoffs, who do they end up playing next? They obviously wouldn't be going on the road to face Ohio State in that instance. Now, do they get one of the Penn State games, or do they get against Texas? You just don't know, but it could change so much of the matchups that we saw this past season.
Yeah, absolutely. And just looking at like some of the other big games, I'll go ahead and let you talk about some of these. You already mentioned Ohio State at Indiana. Huge rematch of a regular season game with the home field advantage flipped. That's one of the most interesting things to me.
Yeah, and then Colorado gets to go on the road against BYU. They didn't play during the regular season. We saw what happened in the bowl game with BYU, kind of beating the brakes off of Colorado. But it would have been interesting to see if Colorado, with a college football playoff berth on the line, might have been able to come back and put up a good fight and maybe get Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter onto the biggest stage in college football.
Yeah, but in my opinion, does this create an argument for a 10-2 BYU team now, who was so dominant early on in the year? If they blow out Colorado, do they now shoot themselves up into that college football playoff conversation with such a dominant win? I mean, we saw in 2014 how Ohio State blew out Wisconsin. That was enough to get them to jump teams who didn't play. Maybe this blowout from BYU over a solid Colorado team would have been enough to at least put them into the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Especially considering where Iowa State was before the Big 12 championship game when they got blown out by Arizona State. You don't know what could happen. BYU would probably leapfrog Iowa State and maybe is on that bubble where Alabama was this past season. And then you get Syracuse at Miami. This would be another huge game. You have two of the best quarterbacks from last season, Kyle McCord and Cam Ward, facing off. And Miami needed one more signature win after starting off undefeated with a couple close wins against some lower ACC teams like Virginia Tech and Cal, in controversial fashion, I might add. But if they were to get a win against Syracuse, then I think they for sure make the college football playoffs. And then maybe even if Syracuse were to get a win, I know they didn't have as good of a record or as good of a resume compared to some of the other teams in the ACC, but if they were to put up a solid win against Miami, they could be looking at a bubble spot, maybe slipping into the playoffs. It changes so much, and there's so many hypotheticals that could have happened with this format. But I do think at the end of the day, it does kind of put aside did the extra game help them get in or hurt them get in? Should a team be hurt if they play an extra game and lose? It kind of fixes a lot of those issues.
That's the biggest thing because I do think it's important to keep conference championships. It's definitely like it's a bragging rights thing to say that you were the SEC champion or the Big Ten champion in the regular season. That's like Oregon can still hold that over Ohio State this season. Ohio State's the national champions, but Oregon won the Big Ten.
If you wanted to, it's almost like men's basketball and women's basketball where you have a regular season conference champ. It's whoever had the best conference record during the regular season because you play them so many times. But then this is essentially the like tournaments, the conference tournaments. Granted, you're only playing one team, but it's the team that's next closest to you. So you can kind of fight over that. So if Penn State were to beat Oregon in the conference championship for this year using this format, then Oregon gets the regular season conference champion, but Penn State gets the bid or whatever in the playoffs.
Yeah, and you can see what the playoffs or you can see all the playoff seedings next to the team's ranks. So we'll go ahead and take a look in a minute at our next idea. So, as everybody knows, the seed is on the right hand side and your rank is on the left hand side. And one of the controversial things this year was the fact that Boise State and Arizona got top four seeds despite not being top four teams because the top four seeds all went to the four highest ranked conference champions. Our next idea is to get rid of that and just do straight seeding of the teams, which is actually something that I saw earlier today. The Big Ten and SEC are trying to push for in this next season. So, this idea we might actually get to see in the 2025 college football playoffs.
Yeah, it brings up the question whether or not automatic buys should be a thing because we did see Boise State was slightly competitive with Penn State in their quarterfinal game, but at the end of the day, they just couldn't hang with Penn State towards the ends. They became kind of one dimensional, but Arizona State proved that they could be a decent team. They were one play away from going to the semifinals to face Ohio State. They could have knocked off Texas. So it you never know what's going to happen with each team, but overall, it does seem like it is somewhat unfair to teams that had tougher schedules and played some closer games with better opponents that they get to suffer a little bit in this case when a team like Boise State gets to have a first round bye.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough argument, but in the end, it does make sense to get rid of the automatic buys for conference champions, especially if we apply our format from before, because every team's going to have played 13 games. So you're not going to have that extra game anymore to where they should need a bye week, which I think is part of the reason that they did it originally. So let's go ahead and take a look at this year's college football playoff. Now, what would this have looked like if we got rid of the automatic buys for Arizona State and Boise State? It would look completely different. So Texas would now be the 3 seed, Penn State the 4, Notre Dame 5 playing Clemson, Ohio State playing Arizona State, Tennessee playing SMU, and Indiana playing Boise State. So this completely changes what our college football playoffs would have looked like. Most likely, you're still going to get Ohio State and Texas, and you're probably going to see Notre Dame, Penn State. You could see a potential Ohio State Georgia game. Maybe Ohio State Tennessee ends up being a semifinal. Oregon could play Penn State again in a rematch of the Big Ten championship, or Oregon Notre Dame. There's just so many things that could have been different, or we could have seen some of the same games as we saw in real life, but it would just have made a little bit more sense in my opinion.
For sure. And this does seem a little bit more fair. Obviously, you're still leaving the door open for teams to upset some of these better teams, like Arizona State. I mean, we saw that they hung in there with Texas. We saw Texas be able to hang in there with Ohio State. So I know the transitive property isn't cut and dry in sports, but Arizona State would have had a chance with Ohio State, I think. I think Boise State, Indiana would have been a really nice game to see if Boise State can replicate what they were able to do against Oregon early in the season against another top Big Ten team. I think Kevin Jennings against Nico Imilava with SMU and Tennessee. I think that would have been an electric offensive battle. And then Clemson, Notre Dame, I think could have turned into an instant classic. I think Cade Klubnik could have made that a very interesting game against Notre Dame's defense. But then that brings up the question, if you do have those upsets, do you reseed the bracket after that? Like if Clemson were to get a win over Notre Dame, does Clemson now play Penn State, or does Oregon get the benefit to play the worst seeded team and they get to play Clemson? And that's another topic that's been floating around on how to fix the playoffs. I don't really think that's how it should work. If you want to compare it to like March Madness, they don't reseed the tournaments. Granted, the NFL does, but I don't think it's necessarily fair to do that just because you have to play a worse opponent as like a lower seed. Like just because Oregon has to play Indiana or Boise State, but Penn State gets to play the lower seeded team, that doesn't mean anything. It's just that's just the way it goes. You have to deal with the cards you're dealt, and that
Yeah,
just goes for any format, whether it's the format that we saw last season or this new format.
I can understand the argument for both formats. My main thing for not reseeding is just the fact that if you're going to win the national championship, you should be able to beat whoever you play because you should be the best team in college football. But let's go ahead and take a look at what reseeding would have looked like if we had this hypothetical college football playoff bracket that we just showed on that last screen. So Indiana, Boise State, probably going with Ashton Genty and Boise State here. Notre Dame, Clemson, like you said, instant classic. I think the Fighting Irish get it done. Ohio State, Arizona State could have been a close game. Cam Skattebo, if he played as well against Texas as he did against Texas, could have given the Buckeyes a run for their money. But Ohio State probably gets that one done. And then Tennessee and SMU, probably going to Tennessee here. Now, as
Yeah,
far as picking all of these matchups, we're just for the rest of this bracket, we're going to stay pretty much true to what happened in real life, just to kind of be realistic.
yeah, and especially nothing changed from the first round. Even with the Boise State technically upsetting Indiana, they're still the lowest seed, so there wasn't really any reseeding. In that rematch between Oregon and Boise State, Ducks are still going to get it done again. Uh, Penn State Notre Dame, same thing. It's a rematch from the Orange Bowl from last year. Still going to say Notre Dame gets it done. Ohio State Texas, same thing. Rematch from the Cotton Bowl. Ohio State's going to get the win here. And then Georgia Tennessee is one that we debated about a little bit. Obviously, Georgia had a great regular season getting into the SEC championship game. But if everything still goes how it went with Carson Beck going down with that injury and Gunnar Stockton having to step in as the starting quarterback, I actually think that Tennessee would able to get the job done and actually beat Georgia. It would be a really close game, but I do think that Tennessee would be able to stand a chance in that game, especially considering they wouldn't necessarily be playing in the conditions they found themselves in Columbus for the first round of this year's playoffs.
Yeah, I agree. And this also allows us to see what the reseeding would look like because Oregon's not going to play Notre Dame and Ohio State's not playing Tennessee because the lowest seed is Tennessee, which means they end up playing Oregon. And we see Ohio State Notre Dame, which was the national championship this year, in the semifinals. So the semifinal games probably going to see Oregon beat Tennessee. And because Ohio State beat Notre Dame in the national championship, we'll put Ohio State through. Ohio State beat Oregon, so Ohio State still wins the national championship in this case. But we see just a very different looking bracket, and you can see in the semifinals what the reseeding would look like. Because it's not just moving through the bracket straight now, you can actually move around in order for the highest seed to get the lowest remaining seed in their game.
Yeah, and my biggest argument for why reseeding shouldn't be a thing, as we see in this bracket, a lot of the matchups ended up being the same thing. We didn't have any upsets in the first round of this year's playoffs, and this one we only had one, and it was Boise State, and they gave Boise State a first round bye this year. So I don't know if I can technically consider that an upset. Second round, like we said, Tennessee was the only one where things ended up moving around a little bit, but you could easily see Georgia winning that game. At the end of the day, reseeding doesn't seem to change very much in what happened. Still would probably have Ohio State as your national champion. Maybe they're not going to play Notre Dame. They're going to play the best regular season team in Oregon. But overall, you're still going to end up with pretty similar results. It's just to appease fans who are upset over their top seeded teams getting hard schedules because they have to play another good team that just lost more in the regular season.
Yeah, and a lot of people cite the NFL as, they reseed in the playoffs. But that works for the NFL partially because you play at the highest seed's home stadium all the way through the conference championships. That's not the case in college football. We have neutral site games, so it's kind of hard for fans of both teams to figure out where they're going to end up traveling. And, the home team for an NFL stadium is going to have majority home fans. College football, it's split 50-50 for the most part. So you have to have two fan bases travel to the same spot, and they're not going to be able to buy tickets until the week before. It just logistically, it's not really very logical. So, what about expanding the playoffs? We saw a 12-team playoff this year, and there's been a lot of talk about expanding the playoffs to 14 teams or even 16 teams. I saw some projections for maybe even 24 teams. That's just a terrible idea, in my opinion. But what do you think about either having a 14 team or a 16 team playoff, Connor?
I definitely think 14 teams or 16 teams would be slightly better. You'd still have some of the same problems if it was just strictly keeping this same model and moving it to 14 or 16 teams, because you're still going to have those bubble teams that are like, okay, why didn't we get in? The 24 teams, just to address it too, 24 team model was just based off of what the FCS does, considering they have 24 teams loaded into their bracket, so everyone gets a chance. I don't think that would necessarily work, because I do think that once you get into the 20s range for the CFP poll, teams start to get a little bit more separation from the teams in the 20 through 15 range. Still could be good games, but I do think 14 teams is probably better. I like the idea of the top two teams still getting a first round bye, because I do think they deserve it, especially this year.
Yeah,
Oregon, being an undefeated team, definitely deserved some reward for being the best team. So I think the bye is in order. And then that second team is arguably going to be from the next best conference, whether that is going to be the SEC, as we've seen throughout the years, or maybe we're going to get like an ACC team like Clemson, or maybe even Notre Dame getting a first round bye. So I do think 14 teams is the better of these two expansion models.
yeah. So let's go ahead and take a look at what a 14 team playoff would have looked like this season. So the current proposed model is for there to be four teams from the Big Ten and SEC both, two teams from the ACC, two teams from the Big 12, one from the Group of Five, and one at large. Sounds really confusing, and it is. That's not really how it should work, in my opinion. I think that you should still just have the best 14 teams in the playoff, and you can save one spot for the Group of Five if you want to. But just the illogical thing here to me is the fact that BYU at number, I think they were 17, is going to end up getting that 14th spot over number 13, Miami.
Yeah, the proposal the Big Ten and SEC are putting forward, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I get what they're trying to do. I agree with them in the sense that the Big Ten and SEC are probably the two best conferences in football. I don't think anyone really can deny that. I think the years of the Clemson dominance with them going back and forth with Alabama is gone. I still think Clemson's a good team, but I don't think the ACC as a whole is on the same level as the SEC teams and the Big Ten teams. And I don't think it's crazy to say that.
I think a lot of that though is really it's factored in when ranking teams because very often we'll see three-loss Big Ten or SEC teams can be ranked ahead of two-loss teams from the Big 12 or ACC.
Mhm.
So I don't think you necessarily need to set a requirement for we have to have four teams get in from our conference. Because I think if you just have the best 14 teams get in, you're probably going to end up with more teams than the ACC and Big 12 in, anyways.
Yeah. And if you want to look at it from last year using that model, you would have had a Tennessee team that lost to an unranked Arkansas in the playoffs. You would have had, I mean, you still did, but you also would have had a Alabama team that lost three games,
Yeah,
including one to 500 Oklahoma that
by
ended up losing
21.
to. that ended up losing to Navy in a bowl game too.
Right.
So I'm not saying Alabama didn't necessarily deserve a spot. I think they could have been a successful team, and I do think in this model a matchup against the Buckeyes would have been an interesting game. But just having the requirement that you have to have four Big Ten and four SEC teams, I do think is kind of crazy. If they deserve to have four or even more spots from those conferences in the college football playoffs, then by all means they can do that. But if that has to be because they're the best teams in the country, not because you have to have four of those teams in.
Yeah, it would have worked out this season because this isn't a completely crazy bracket. But I'd be worried to see, if for some reason the Big Ten has a really off year and your fourth best team is, I don't know, an 8-4 Iowa that's unranked, then now we have a problem because you have an unranked team potentially getting into the playoffs at a 14 seed. It's just not logical. But we'll go ahead and take
Exactly.
a look now at the 16 team model, which is really the same as this, but instead of the one at large, you have three at larges. It's still four from the Big Ten, four from the SEC, and you'll end up with two ACC, two Big 12, and one Group of Five. So this just adds Ole Miss, and then it adds Miami, and South Carolina, ranked number 15, doesn't get in again because of BYU.
Yeah. Not much matchup wise changes, but like you said, South Carolina still gets kind of hosed in this situation. You could have picked BYU, you could have picked South Carolina. The matchups would have been interesting, but having 16 teams, like I was saying at the very beginning when we were talking about expansion, you're still going to have those debates about which team deserves to be in or based off of the resume or whatever. You're still going to have those
Yeah,
bubble teams. You're still going to have, in this situation, South Carolina fans that are upset about why didn't we get in because
and they
we
they
didn't
would have
we
had that
didn't lose to
debate with
this
Ole
team.
Miss for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it would have been between South Carolina and Ole Miss. And again, this can go back to our suggestion earlier of having every team play during conference championship week. If South Carolina goes on the road and beats LSU, and Ole Miss were to either even just beat Texas A&M, or if they lose to Texas A&M, now South Carolina has a much better argument to be that 14 seed over Ole Miss. All right. Now we move on to our proposal, which is definitely a little bit out there. And it's not going to be what you're thinking at all because everybody has been talking about the number of teams that we should put into the playoffs. But what if we looked at it completely differently? What if we didn't set a number of teams, but instead set the requirements? Because in the end, that's what everybody complains about. It's, well, my team should have gotten in because we did this, and the requirements seem to change every year. So what if we just made those the same? In this scenario, there are no conference championships anymore. We don't have that 13th week. If you lose 3 games, you are ineligible for the college football playoff. It's as simple as that. In my opinion, even if you were to lose to 3 top 5 teams, at that point, you're no longer worthy of being a national champion. If you lose 3 games, 3 strikes and you're out. That's my opinion. I honestly think that at no point should we ever see a 3-loss national champion. All 2-loss Power Four and Notre Dame are eligible. So if you 2 games or 2 losses or fewer, if you're Notre Dame or a Power Four team, you are eligible for the college football playoff, as well as the highest ranked Group of Five team. And there will be some sort of minimum strength of schedule rating, so you can't just schedule all FCS teams in your non-conference to try and make sure you're not losing games. There's still going to be some sort of requirement there. It's too hard for us to try and calculate that right now, but there wouldn't be a way to try and game the system in a sense. So what would this have looked like? This year, it would have been pretty similar to that 14-team playoff. And we'll go through every single year since 2014 and kind of show you what it would have looked like. So this season, there would have been 14 teams which are eligible for our playoffs, and it would have been based on the rankings before conference championship week. So some of the matchups are pretty different. You see Indiana SMU, Georgia, Arizona State, Iowa State Notre Dame, Penn State BYU, Miami, Ohio State, and Boise State Tennessee. What do you think about this, Connor?
It's very interesting because, like you said, with conference championship week eliminated from this, you have teams like Iowa State that were so good during the regular season not being punished for getting blown out in their conference championship game. They still get a chance to play in the college football playoffs and show that they can win against the top teams. Granted, Notre Dame would be an uphill battle, but they get to prove themselves. That's why you play the game. BYU, same thing after having a starting off 10-0 on, or they start off 10-0 or
Yeah,
9
they
and
did.
0.
It was
10 and
either
0.
9 and 0 or 10 and 0. Close enough.
But basically, you started off so dominant, and then you kind of fell down the stretch. But you still get in. You still get a chance to prove that you belong there. It goes for all these teams, like with them being on the bubble, but still meeting these requirements. They get to show that there's a reason why they finished with that record and were in consideration for being
Yeah.
in the playoffs in the other system. But in this system, we're awarding them for based off of how they performed that season, and they get to show what they got.
And we'll see the same basic format of the first round will be played at home stadiums. So Indiana's playing at SMU, Arizona State's playing at Georgia, Iowa State at Notre Dame. You get the picture. And then the quarterfinals will be neutral site games at New Year's Six Bowls. Same with the semifinals. So you still get all of your New Year's Six Bowls. Your bowl contracts are met. So now let's go ahead and move past 2024. What would this have looked like in 2023? Well, we wouldn't have had 14 teams. We would have had 15 teams, which were eligible for the 2023 college football playoffs. And this would have been another incredible bracket.
Yeah, right off the bat, this fixes the probably the most talked about discussion about the college football playoffs and why we went to 12 teams in the first place. Florida State gets to make the college football playoffs. They actually, it worked out. They would have had essentially the ACC championship game from that year. They would have got to play Louisville. Granted, it still would have likely been without Jordan Travis, but they get to show that, hey, we can still win in college football playoff with a backup quarterback. You don't have that issue of did they deserve to get in despite having basically the reason they were so successful drop out with an injury. So that's the biggest thing. But then you get Ohio State, Ole Miss in the picture, Washington, Iowa, Oregon, Oklahoma, Missouri, Alabama. A lot of these top teams get to compete against other top teams to try to progress forward, and Georgia being the number one team going into SEC championship week and losing to Alabama still gets that number one seed for having the best regular season of all these teams.
Yeah, and in this case, they are the only team to get a bye. So let's move on now to 2022. We'll start moving a little bit quicker, and we'll kind of just hit on some of the key years. So 2022 would have been pretty different. Only 11 teams make it in 2022. We see Ohio State and USC just automatically playing each other in the quarterfinals. You got Clemson at Penn State. That would have been an amazing game. Tulane, the best group of five team that year, they get to go play Alabama. They're going to say they want Bama. They're going to get Bama. Washington at Tennessee in order to play Michigan. Another great game there. So 2021, this was the biggest playoffs that we had in this experiment going back to 2014. 16-team playoff. Again, this would have been, I mean, this looks amazing. You get 8 home games for all of the top 8 seeds, and then you can still move on to all of your New Year's Six bowl games. Just, I mean, look at some of these matchups.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And another thing about this format is you can still get variations in teams getting in. In this one, you see Pitt got in, Wake Forest got into the playoffs. Granted, they're going to get matched up with the number one seed in Georgia, but they still get in. Oklahoma State gets into this one, having not lost to Baylor in the Big 12 championship game. Baylor still gets in. It's it still leaves room for variety. You're not always going to have the Ohio States, Alabama's, Georgia's always in. They're going to be one of the higher seeds and probably have the best chance to win the Natty, but you still are going to get variety and chances for other
Yeah.
teams to make runs.
And how about in 2021? Obviously, the big story was Cincinnati getting that 4 seed and making the college football playoffs. They now get a home game against Iowa. They have a chance to move on and play in a quarterfinal game against either BYU or Oklahoma State. There's a chance for Cincinnati to really, make a run here, potentially get to the semifinals, that kind of thing. Now, we're going to skip 2020 because it just doesn't even make sense to try and apply this format to a season where nobody even played the same number of games. So we'll go straight to 2019, and boy, is this one interesting.
This is probably what everyone wished happened. If we talked about this entire bracket, we'd probably end up with an LSU Ohio State national championship because you're not going to have that Ohio State Clemson game on the same side. You're going to have probably the rematch of the Natty with Clemson and LSU playing each other, but you get Memphis into this bracket. You get Oklahoma, Alabama, with Alabama having to go on the road. Baylor hosting Penn State, Utah hosting Oregon. There's so many good games in this bracket, and you're probably going to end up with the two best teams facing off in the national championship because the only difference with this one is Ohio State won their conference championship, and so did LSU this year. But LSU stomped Alabama or stomped Georgia,
Georgia.
who in this bracket is a 4 seed, whereas Ohio State beat Wisconsin in their bowl
They beat
in their
Wisconsin,
conference
right?
championship, and LSU was able to leap over Ohio State. But in this one, we're rewarding Ohio State for the regular season. A lot of people say that Ohio State team was one of the best that we've ever seen, and the one of the best that didn't win a national championship because of 2019 Clemson and because they would have gotten that chance to play 2019 LSU with that stacked roster of Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase,
Yeah.
and
And
everyone else.
LSU almost for sure wins that national championship, but that's what everybody wanted to see. That would have been just an incredible game because both of those offenses were just amazing. So let's move on to 2018 now. This is our smallest playoffs, where we see only 9 teams make the college football playoff, as you had UCF ranked number 8. This was one of the years where they went undefeated. And just everybody else slots right in, and you only have 9 teams in the college football playoff. But this is still a really good bracket. I mean, Ohio State's going to play Notre Dame, Michigan, Clemson, Georgia, Oklahoma. Alabama gets the winner of Washington State, UCF, probably the worst game out of all of those. That might as well just put Alabama into the semifinals on this bracket. Just give them a double bye.
Hey, UCF wanted Alabama all of that season. They're going to finally get Bama, like we said earlier.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and move on to 2017 now. This time we get a 13-team playoff. And you can see the number of teams varies every year. But the thing that doesn't change is the requirements. If you're a 2-loss or fewer Power 4 team or Notre Dame and the best group of 5 team, you are in the college football playoff. There's no, oh, I had the same number of losses and I got left out. Or this team had fewer or had more losses and they got in. It's just a simple requirement, and if you meet it, you're in. It's really, really easy. It's as easy as that. So just, I mean, some of these matchups are great. You get a rematch of Ohio State, Penn State. Washington's playing at Alabama. UCF at Wisconsin. That probably would have been a really good game in 2017. TCU at Georgia. Hopefully that's a little bit better than 2022. USC at Miami. Auburn gets the 2 seed. I mean, all of these are just amazing.
Yeah. And going back to what you were talking about because the requirements never change. A lot of people said that just the selection committee themselves is something that needs to be fixed, especially considering that people on the committee are current like heads at certain universities. So you're worried about bias or, oh, I'm going to put in more Big Ten teams because I'm the chairman of some Big Ten school or whatever. This eliminates that bias because you have to follow the requirements. There are like
Yeah,
guidelines for what you have to follow. So you can't say, oh, this team lost to whoever. They lost to this unranked like 500 team. Oh, they don't get to get in. No, if they have two or less losses, meet the strength of schedule requirements, so on and so forth, they get to prove why they belong in the playoffs.
yeah. The college football playoff committee in this case only has two jobs. Job number one, seed the teams. Job number two is just picking that highest ranked group of five school, which, you can have some arguments there. If there were, say, two undefeated group of five schools and they both met that strength of schedule requirement we talked about earlier, now you can talk about, okay, maybe we'll throw an extra game in there so we can have both of those teams get in. And you can actually do that. You can just say, okay, we'll have an extra team in the playoffs this year. It's that simple because there's no set requirement and you can have an extra home game. So looking at 2016, this time it's an 11-team college football playoff. You get an undefeated Western Michigan gets to play against Penn State, West Virginia, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Colorado, and then, Michigan, Washington is an automatic quarterfinal matchup.
I remember nothing about this year. I didn't even realize that Colorado was a decent team in 2016.
Yeah,
I assume,
this was one of the Alabama Clemson games. I believe it was Bama Clemson 2. That was the year that I think
yes,
it was Alabama and
because
Washington, and they blew Washington out, and Clemson blew out Ohio State.
yeah,
Yeah. So
correct.
then 2015, this time we get a 15-team playoff. Another really interesting looking playoff.
I think the biggest addition on this one is you get the best non-quarterback in college football in 2015 into the playoffs. You get Christian McCaffrey and the Stanford Cardinal into the playoffs. And
Yeah,
they
who
get
knows what they
a
would have done?
exactly they get a home matchup against North Carolina. I mean, Stanford lose to Michigan State in the Rose Bowl that year? Because this was the year Michigan State beat Ohio State. Ohio State that was Ohio State's one
I think
loss.
didn't Michigan State get into the playoffs this
Yeah,
season?
they did. They did. I think they played. I thought they played
They played
Stanford or
Alabama.
something.
No, they played
Maybe I'm
Alabama.
thinking of. I think I'm thinking of a different year then.
I think
Um,
you might be. You might be. But just overall, this is, I mean, this just looks like an incredible playoffs, aside from maybe Houston playing at Alabama. That one's tough.
there's
But
so
let's
many
go ahead
Big
and
Ten
take,
teams in here though.
yeah, oh
Big
yeah, that
State,
is really
Northwestern,
interesting.
Iowa, Ohio State. That's
There's
it's
four.
loaded, but like that's the thing.
Yeah.
It
It's
seems
just
like a
not the
lot
ones
more.
you'd
They're all
expect.
crowded around
Yeah.
each other.
Not the ones you'd expect for sure.
Hmm.
So let's look at the inaugural college football playoff now, because there was a lot of debate around this one too, where Baylor and TCU got left out in favor of Ohio State. Now, since all of this is happening before conference championship week, TCU gets a bye. Baylor still gets in. They get to play Wisconsin at home. Ohio State plays Missouri at home. And now they have to play Florida State or Boise State, most likely Jameis Winston and Florida State. But just so many great matchups here. That Mississippi State team that was number one in the inaugural CFP rankings, they get to be in the playoffs now.
Georgia Tech at 10, Arizona at 7. I mean, I don't remember a thing about either of those teams for 2014, but like I said, you get variety. It doesn't
Yeah,
matter how many teams or whatever, as long as they meet the requirements. Like we've been saying this entire time, you just have to meet the requirements and you can get in. So you're still going to have a bunch of new teams make the playoffs every year.
yeah, it just overall, I think that there's going to be a lot of pushback to this like argument from us to maybe not have a specific number of teams. And really, the only argument that I can see is the logistics of TV contracts. But if you do it just based on the normal system that like, you're still going to have all your New Year's Six games. So really, it's just TV companies are going to be bidding for those home games, and
Mhm.
they won't know how many home games there's going to be until about 3 weeks before. But that's really something that I don't think would actually be that difficult to work out. The major TV companies are going to have rights to the home games first. There's going to be some sort of list there. Maybe you can do it by conference. The TV company that has a deal with this conference, if that conference gets a home game, they get first dibs on that game. I don't think it would really be that difficult to work out, in my opinion.
Yeah, and now we saw this past year with the 12 team format, but with this format, I think it would get slightly increased. Now you're going to have more competition with the NFL and their playoffs, but I think now, considering you're going to have most likely more home playoff games or just more games in general, I think that's going to be more competition between college football and the NFL. I know a lot of college football fans are very vocal that college football is just straight up better than the NFL, and I might agree with them, but I think having more of these games might lead to more discussions between the two greater organizations, between the NCAA and the NFL, about scheduling, so you don't have those weird overlaps where you're going to have a New Year's Six bowl game on the same day as some other, like a wild card game or whatever conflicts that we had this past playoff.
Yeah, I mean, we saw how interesting the 12-team playoff was this season. And just imagine if you set the requirements first, every single team deserves to be there. You're going to have so many good games, so many matchups that you wouldn't otherwise see. And really, it all is a mystery until we see the very last game. Nothing is certain until then. And I think that's another one of the appeals of this.
It turns into March Madness
Yeah,
without it being 64 teams.
the madness is how many teams there's going to be. So yeah, we want to know if you guys have any suggestions. What do you think of this idea that we just proposed? Both the logical one and our ideal world scenario. So go ahead and comment below. We'll respond just like we do on pretty much every video. Make sure to let us know what you think. And anyways, thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video.